Good afternoon. I'm Tyler Spears, Managing Partner at BKCW in Austin and an IIT board member. Thanks for joining us for another virtual InsureCon session. I hope you enjoyed the earlier sessions with Steve McKee and Texas Mutual. If you missed them, all the virtual InsureCon sessions are being recorded and will be available on iiat.org on Monday. Before we get started, I have a couple of announcements. First, I want to extend my thanks to IIAT's lead underwriters for making virtual InsureCon possible. It's because of their generosity that this program is available for free to members. Thank you to Union Standard Insurance Group, Texas Mutual Insurance Company, UFG, Allied Trust, Central Insurance Companies, Service Lloyds, Liberty Mutual Insurance, Safeco Insurance, Imperial Premium Financing, Travelers, State Auto Insurance Companies, Nationwide, Swiss Re, and IIAT Advantage E&O and Markets. I also want to tell you about 3 new webinars that IIAT's Angela Ford will be presenting starting in July. First one is Practical Strategies to Avoid Potential E&O based on agency service standards. The second one is Know Your Agency Data and Workflows. And last, Using Technology and Tools to Stay Focused on Agency Customer Experiences. Look for details for these 3 new webinars in your inbox soon. Our speaker this afternoon is Dustin Mooney. Dustin is co-founder and principal consultant of RigidBits, leading the security program development, incident response, and computer forensics practices. Dustin specializes in computer and digital forensics. His 8 years conducting forensic investigations has honed his skills in quickly learning new environments, identifying potential areas of risk, and discovering breaches and vulnerabilities. Please join me in welcoming Dustin Mooney.
Thank you so much. And before we get started, I just wanted to say thank you to the IIAT for inviting RigidBits here to give this presentation and just acknowledge the fact that this was supposed to be in person and shifting to this virtual conference. We know that that's a difficult and challenging task. So I just want to acknowledge the hard work that's been put into making this happen. And so before we get started, again, I just want to talk a little bit about what we're going to be covering today. So I'm going to be talking to you about cybersecurity, to be introducing some basic topics, cybersecurity 101, some concepts that we really need to get on top of. And then after we have that foundation, after we have that base that we can work with, I'm going to start showing you some very specific things that you can go do and implement for your agencies that are going to greatly reduce your risk and so that you can operate in a safer level, okay? So just to tell you a little bit about myself, my name is Dustin. I am with RigidBits. We're a cybersecurity company. We specialize in helping our clients identify their cybersecurity risks. And then what we do is we offer consultative services to help reduce that risk to an acceptable level. And as you see here, I have several degrees in cybersecurity, and my main function is computer forensics. So I am the person that comes in after a company has been hacked and after something bad has happened, and I get to do an assessment of some of the findings. How did these things happen? What sort of data got out? What was a hacker doing and looking for? And I think that this gives me a unique approach to cybersecurity because I really get to see the end result of what happens to companies when they don't implement cybersecurity best practices. So there's a lot of big lessons that I've learned over the course of the years. And basically what I'm going to be doing today is I'm going to be just your translator. I'm going to be taking some of these basic cybersecurity concepts that you would find if you opened up a cybersecurity textbook. And I'm just going to convey these to you in a very simplified way, and I'm going to try to bring them all together so that we can find some very practical and actionable items that we can take out of here and we can start implementing to reduce our risk. So on the agenda today, we're going to be talking about cybersecurity 101. And something that I want to mention about this particular topic, and quite frankly, the entire presentation is, as I go through this, you're going to start hearing some key words that are going to show up over and over and over again. And the reason why these are showing up so frequently is that they're very important to understand so that we can make smart cybersecurity decisions. So we're going to really start with a foundational level here at Cybersecurity 101. After we've got those baselines down, we're going to move over to the approach of cybersecurity. I think the big takeaway here being is that a very smart group of people have figured out how to do cybersecurity and a very specific approach to getting these things implemented. So we don't need to recreate that process. We just need to learn how to follow it. So I'm going to show you what that process looks like in a very simplified way. And then finally, we'll wrap up with some very specific action items. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the concepts that we learned in the second section here, and we're going to actually go through together how we would address one of the big wins here that I'm going to list. And so I'm going to show you how to do these things so that when you leave this presentation and you decide that you want to go implement the rest of the items on the list, you now have an understanding of the approach of how to get that done. Okay. And so the objectives here that I hope people will leave after they're finished with this presentation is that they understand a risk-based approach to cybersecurity. We're going to be talking about a concept of a framework. And a framework for cybersecurity is just a guide. It's going to tell you, if you think about doing cybersecurity, here are the concepts that you should consider. And as you do that, you're going to start seeing some action items that come out of your framework, right? So we're going to talk about the concept of a POAM, or a plan of action and milestones. This is going to be your guiding documentation that you're going to pull out the action items and place them in so that you can track your progress. You can start checking them off and see how you're doing. And then we're also going to use this POAM document to follow so that we can actually implement these cybersecurity best practices. So those are the objectives for today. And with that, let's go ahead and dive into Cybersecurity 101. So to get started here, I just want to read this quote to here. This is actually one of my quotes. This is something that I've come up with, and it says, "There is no secure. There is only more or less risk." And so I just want to talk a little bit about what I mean by that. And as a cybersecurity consultant, I spend a lot of time talking with potential clients, talking to vendors, listening to vendors talk to some of my clients. And there's a pretty repetitive theme that I see coming up, and a lot of people like to talk about the products that they're selling and the situations of their environment, and they like to use this word secure. And I understand the intent, I understand the purpose, but from my perspective, the word secure is a little bit more of a marketing tool as opposed to something that we should be using to make decisions about cybersecurity. And so one of the biggest problems I have with secure is that it really just gives you two opportunities. You either are secure or you're not secure. And what we really should be doing is thinking about our cybersecurity in terms of risk. And the reason why we want to do that is that risk operates on a sliding scale. And there are many possibilities and many opportunities to fall in different areas on that sliding scale. And therefore, we can have a better understanding of where we're actually at when it comes to cybersecurity. So let's talk a little bit about risk, and let's break it down so that we can understand what that looks like. So at the top here, we have the risk formula. This is the likelihood of a negative cybersecurity event happening to you and the impact that that would have on the data and the systems that you rely on to conduct your business functions. And so once we understand those impacts, we can eventually get to the impacts to our business. I tend to find that a lot of companies and people that I work with tend to go straight to the business impact. But just to make it really clear, we need to think about the impacts to the data and the systems first. And so the interesting thing about risk and these variables is that these variables also operate on a sliding scale. So for likelihood, something may be more or less likely to happen to you. And the same thing for impact. The impacts may be greater or the impacts may be less. Okay, so there's a range of opportunity and a range of possibilities here when we use these concepts. So I want to go over here on the left side for likelihood and break this down a little bit. And to really understand the likelihood of something happening, we need to understand the concept of a vulnerability. And so what a vulnerability is it's a flaw in a piece of software, hardware, a person, a process, a router or a switch or an operating system, basically any sort of technology. So this is a flaw. And so these flaws get introduced, and when hackers are looking for them, what they do is they find these vulnerabilities and they launch attacks against them, and we call these exploits. So when you try to exploit a vulnerability, this is what an attack looks like. And again, just to repeat the concepts that I'm saying here, some vulnerabilities are more severe than others, and some vulnerabilities are less severe than others. So I want to talk a little bit about what that looks like and what would make something more or less severe. So these are the four ideas that we really need to get on top of to understand the severity of vulnerabilities. So the first one being, how difficult is it to find? If I'm a hacker and I'm looking for this vulnerability, Is it easy for me to find this, or is it going to be very challenging? The second one being, is it difficult to exploit? If I'm going to take advantage of this vulnerability, is it a very difficult task ahead of me, or is it something that I can do very easily? The third one being community awareness. How many hackers know that you have this vulnerability? Excuse me. And how many hackers can start going after you? If only one hacker knows about it, you have a little bit less of an attack surface. If the whole hacker community is aware that this vulnerability exists, you have more people coming at you. And then finally, the ability to stop and detect that these attacks are happening. So if you've implemented some cybersecurity best practices, you may be able to detect when an exploit is being launched against a vulnerability. And so what would a high severity vulnerability look like? Well, basically what we do is we take all of these and we'll think about it like this. A high severity vulnerability would be very easy to find. It would be very easy to exploit. Maybe the hacker can go download the exploit from a website and launch it against you. That's pretty simple. Community awareness, a lot of people know that this vulnerability exists. And then finally, if you haven't implemented any cybersecurity best practices to detect and stop it, you now have a very high severity vulnerability. And then if you look at that concept in the mirror, a low severity vulnerability would basically just be the opposite, right? Very difficult to find, very difficult to exploit. Very few people know about it, and you've implemented some cybersecurity best practices. So that's the concept of a vulnerability. So continuing on, let's go ahead and jump over here to impact. And to understand the impacts to the data and the systems that we're working on, we need to understand a concept called the CIA of cybersecurity. And this is confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So confidentiality being, can I keep the information secret that I want to remain secret? If you're having some sort of communication over email about a financial transaction with your CFO that's specific to your business, this would be something that you would want to keep confidential. And if a hacker were able to read that, you now have a breach of confidentiality. So we need to think about the impacts that way. The second one, integrity being, can I trust that the data that I'm using, the data that I'm relying on to conduct my business has not been changed or altered? And if it has, what would the impact be to me? So using that kind of same example of this financial transaction, if a hacker changed the routing number and the account number of where this was supposed to go, this would be an attack on integrity because the information that you're relying on has been changed. And then finally, the last one, availability. Do I have the ability to access the systems that I need to do my job? And do I have the availability to access the data that I need to do my job? And so just imagine a situation where maybe you can't get into your email and you need to have this conversation, right? This would be an issue of availability. And then just to repeat it one more time, this CIA is very specific impacts first to the data that you're using and the systems that you're using to process and store that data. And then once we come to a conclusion of what those impacts may be, we can finally figure out how that would ultimately impact the business. And then just for this last bullet point here, really what we're trying to do when it comes to cybersecurity is we're trying to identify what our cybersecurity risks are, and then we're going to implement cybersecurity best practices to mitigate those risks at an acceptable level. So that is cybersecurity 101. Now I want to take it a little bit further and talk about this concept of risk and security, because I think this is very important and I see this coming up a lot. And unfortunately, I see people using this concept of secure to make decisions. So we really want to just put that to the side and let it go. So let me explain to you a little bit more detail why risk is the way that we think about cybersecurity. So when we do a risk assessment, what we're really doing is we're quantifying and we're qualifying our risks. Okay, so risk is qualifiable and quantifiable. The word secure, it really is limited in quantification. Your quantification is it either is or it isn't, right? So you have two choices here. And I do have no qualification, but in a sense, the qualification would be this system is secure and this system is not secure. And so, again, you really only have two opportunities, whereas risk up here, if you look at this heat map, this heat bar, you can see that there's many different opportunities to fall in it. So we have a little bit more of a clear picture of where we actually are. Another big thing about risk, as we just talked about, is that it considers likelihood and the impacts to the data and the systems, right? Whereas the word secure, it alludes to the likelihood of an attack. Basically, if something's secure, you're alluding to the fact that you will not be compromised, right? And unfortunately, though, what it does is it ignores the impacts to your data and system. And so this is really a bad way to think about cybersecurity because we need to think about those impacts. If we are wrong or if something does go wrong, how will that impact us? And so if we operate under this idea of secure and we ignore that, unfortunately, we may be misinterpreting reality and not really thinking about what could actually be happening to us. And so just to make it really clear, if we're going to make decisions about cybersecurity, we need to calculate what our risks are, and then we need to categorize those risks and organize them from what are our highest risks to what are our lowest risks. You can't do that with secure because you only get two choices. So if we're going to make decisions, we'll do that based off of risk. And then one more thing about risk that I really want to point out is that you can accept risk. You can say, this is okay with me. And so as we use technology to run our businesses and as we use technology to become more efficient, there's a cost associated with that, and that cost is risk. And so if you're working with a vendor and they're telling you that their products are secure, it really does kind of leave this, I guess, uncertainty, if you will, that we really want to avoid. And so if we are trying to eliminate risk as well, we tend to be making fear-based decisions about our cybersecurity, and we don't want to do that. As you use technology, you will never be able to get rid of your risks, but what you can do is you can lower your risk to an acceptable level. Now, I just want to jump back really quick to this, this formula here for likelihood and impact, and I want to mention cyber liability insurance. So cyber liability insurance is probably something that the individuals on the line may be selling or you're thinking about selling. But if you look at the risk formula, the question that I have for you is, where does cyber liability fall in the risk formula? So I'll just give you a second to think about that. And then I'll go ahead and answer this for you. So cyber liability insurance falls directly under the impact of an attack, okay? And the point I really want to make here is that it does nothing to reduce the likelihood of a hacker going after you. And so let's say you're a company or you're an agency and you have cyber liability insurance and you've done nothing to reduce your likelihood. You know, you may be finding yourself in a situation where you are filing numerous cyber liability claims a year. This is going to look really bad. It's going to make your premiums go up and you might get dropped from your policy, right? So this is something that we want to avoid. So we can't just rely on cyber liability insurance to protect us. We also have to do something to reduce the likelihood of an attack. So with that, what I want to do is, now that we have that basic concept of risk and we understand that this is how we make cybersecurity decisions, I want to talk a little bit about how this plays into the approach of what we're doing to implement cybersecurity best practices. So before I really dive into this, I want to start here with these two concepts. And these two concepts, as I said earlier in the presentation, is if you opened up a cybersecurity book, and you were going to go learn about cybersecurity, I can 100% guarantee you that these words, due diligence and due care, will come up. So I want to explain this to you and help you understand how this fits into the big picture. So due diligence, basically the textbook answer is doing what a reasonable person would do to protect their business, okay? So if you're taking in customer data, you have sensitive information and non-public information, your due diligence may look something like this. I acknowledge that I have this sensitive information in, and I have client and customer data, and I acknowledge that I need to protect it. Okay, that would be a due diligence. So this is self-governance. It's a decision on yourself about what you're going to do. And then due care is the follow through. So once you decide to do something, you actually have to go implement it. You have to go do it. So that's how these two items go together. And just to I guess, make it even more clear, I like to use analogies when I talk about cybersecurity. Sometimes they're about cars. This one's about going to the gym. But let's use this example of due diligence and due care. If I was going to go to the gym and I decided I wanted to get in shape and I wanted to increase my cardio and go sweat. So if I said this to myself, I want to go to the gym, I want to get in shape, this would be my due diligence statement. It's a great first thought to have. But as we all know, saying that and actually going to the gym are two very different things, right? So going in and picking up the weights and putting them down and sweating and running on the treadmill, right? This is your follow through. This is due care. And so you can quickly see that if we don't have both of these together, we kind of have a problem. So we really want to bring these together. So the other thing that I really want to say about this, the question that I see a lot is, whose responsibility is it to do cybersecurity at my company? Well, based off of this slide, it's your responsibility. If you have a job function that you have to implement cybersecurity best practices, or you've been tasked with meeting compliance, it comes down on you. And some of the mistakes that I see, unfortunately, is that sometimes businesses and agencies and my clients is that they work with managed service providers or IT providers, and they make assumptions that IT is doing these tasks for them. And that really is not practicing your due diligence and due care, because as the business owner, it falls down on you. So you really need to go back and verify that your IT provider is doing these things and that they're doing them correctly too, because cybersecurity takes a very specific set of knowledge. So just make sure that you have checked that. So moving on, after we've decided that we're going to do something about cybersecurity, this really is the rest of this model really is the implementation, right? So we're going to practice our due diligence, we're going to practice our due care. And as you go through this planning phase, I think what's going to happen is you're quickly going to realize that you're going to have to allocate some resources. And what I mean by that is there may be a budget that you need to allocate to address these items. Maybe you have to assign some of these tasks to an internal employee. That's a resource that you're paying for, right? Who's going to be distracted maybe from their main job functions. Or maybe you need to work with an outside company like RigidBits to come in and help you get on top of some of these tasks. So cybersecurity really is a core business function now, the same way that you have HR, the same way that you have accounting, you also need to have your cybersecurity under control. So if you need help, feel free to get it. And then you also want to come up with a strategy and a plan. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about what that looks like and how to get there. So on the second side of this slide here, we have this concept called a framework. And as I mentioned earlier, a framework is a cybersecurity guide. It tells you these are the concepts that you want to go think about as they pertain to cybersecurity and go address. And so when you pick your framework, I want to say something very clear about this. These are free. You can go download these off the internet, and there's a lot of different ones. The one that we're looking up here is the CIS 20 controls, okay? So frameworks often overlap. There may be some differences between them, but if you went and implemented the CIS controls and you went and grabbed a different framework, you'd probably be about 90% of the way there. So there's a lot of overlap. So you just got to pick the one that fits your business the best. Now, as you do this too, you might be looking at the types of laws that you need to abide by. There may be some compliance requirements. I know a lot of people on the line have probably heard about 23 NYC RR 500, right? This is the New York State Data Security Law. The NAIC, the National Association for Insurance Commissioners, has taken this data security law, and some of the states are using it as a model, right? So I think we're at about 10 states that have compliance requirements. I don't think Texas is one yet. But if you do want to work towards this compliance, because I promise eventually it will come, you can use that state law, and that state law essentially is a framework. And so if you did all of your CIS controls and then you had to meet your New York compliance, you'd probably be about 90% of the way there. So I think that's the big takeaway from this, is that there's definitely this overlap. And I want to just point to, what you see on the screen here. So under this basic list here, so the first, I believe there are first 8. There really are 3 categories. You have the very basic ones at the front. So if you take a look at these, right, inventory, hardware assets. So what does that mean? Well, that means knowing what hardware is on your network, knowing which employees have computers, have cell phones, have tablets that they're using to conduct their business. And so this number 1 is called a control family, okay? So there's 20 control families. So under this control family, there's going to be some very other specific controls. And a control is basically the cybersecurity concept that you should consider. So looking at number 2, very similar to number 1, but this one is about software. So do I know what software is running on those machines? Are some of my employees illegally downloading software and installing it on my company computers, right? So I need to know if these things are happening. So this is number 2. And then I'm not going to go through all of them, but number 3 here, continuous vulnerability management. Have I found the vulnerabilities that exist in my network? And if I have, what's the process of making sure that I'm able to get on top of those? So this is what it would look like working through a framework. So moving on, after we've picked our framework, after we know which laws that we need to abide by, what we're going to do is we're going to identify what are risks by conducting a risk assessment. Now, I just want to acknowledge that this point is very difficult. If you do not work in the cybersecurity space, if you don't have years of education and training about how to conduct a risk assessment, this is going to be really hard. So this might be one of those things where you go, okay, I need some help with this. You could definitely take a stab at it. There's some free guides out there. There are some frameworks about risk assessments that you could go download, but I'll caution you that they're very technical. They can be very long and challenging to read. So again, this may be something that you want to get some help with. And so after you've conducted your risk assessment to find out what your risks are, you're going to categorize those risks. You're going to list the most important risks at the top, all the way down to the bottom to your least important risks. Now, usually what we want to do is start at the top, pick the biggest items first, and try to address those. But there also is a lot of value in maybe picking some of the easier things to accomplish. Maybe they're a little bit lower in the severity of your risks. But if you start checking those items off and you start implementing cybersecurity best practices to remediate those vulnerabilities that were identified in your risk assessment, these are going to be big wins and they're going to add up over time. And that's kind of what we're going to do today. So some of those risks at the top of your list, again, might be kind of hard to know what to do about. So you might need some help getting on top of that. And as you categorize your risks and you've identified some of the vulnerabilities during that risk assessment process, what we want to do is stay organized. So we're going to use something called our plan of action and milestones. We call this a POAM, okay? And so what we're going to do is just list them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we're going to give some descriptions about them. Okay, here's vulnerability 1, here's what it means, and here's what I want to do about it. And as you use this document to track the progress that you're making about your cybersecurity program, the great thing about it is you're going to be able to see where you're at. You're going to be able to see what you finished. You're going to be able to see what's coming up next. And you're also going to know which of those items are the most important to you. Also a great tool if you have some responsibility in cybersecurity and you need to go to your management and say, hey, look at all the great things I've done to reduce our risk over this year. It's a great tool for tracking that. So I highly encourage you to get a plan of action and milestones and follow it. So once you have the things that you want to do listed, the next thing that you have to do is document your efforts. So cybersecurity, and this slide really here is a summary of cybersecurity, documenting the things that you're going to do and that you have done, and then going and implementing them. So you really want to centrally document your policies and procedures. So what does that look like? Well, I'm going to take a guess that a lot of people on the line have heard of something called a written information security plan. If you've ever looked at a compliance law or requirement, this is your central document that explains how you're going to address cybersecurity, right? So you need to have this central location. And as you start writing these policies and procedures for the items that are on your plan of action and milestones, make sure that you start checking those off. And again, maybe a little bit more of a challenging part, going and implementing the cybersecurity best practices. This is going to take some technical knowledge. You might need to lean on your IT provider or your managed service provider or an IT person in your company, or maybe somebody with IT familiarity so that they can actually go do these things. And as you write your policies and procedures, you want to follow your policies and procedures. So make sure that you're following the documented procedure. And so this is basically how you do cybersecurity. So I'm going to come back to this in a second, but let's go ahead and show what are some of the big wins that we can do that don't take a lot of effort. And just to repeat it one more time, if we can find these small little vulnerabilities or fix, these small reductions in risk really add up over time. Okay, so let's go ahead and see what those look like. So the first one being, we want to, well, looks like my presentation maybe had missed something. There's something before we want to configure the cloud-based system. So before we do this, we actually want to create an inventory of cloud-based systems, right? So a lot of agencies I've noticed kind of have this hybrid model, or they're existing purely in the cloud. And a big problem that I'm noticing is that they don't know all of the systems and applications that they're using in the cloud, right? So the first step would be create an inventory of what those items are. I'm going to guess you probably have 15 to 20 cloud-based systems that you're relying on to use and things that you use to function your business on a daily basis. So once we know what those are, what you need to do is you need to log into those systems and you need to turn on multi-factor authentication. This is MFA. And I want to spend a little bit of time explaining to you about the word authentication so that we can understand why multi-factor authentication is so important. So in cybersecurity authentication, what we do is we think about this term in three different ways. The first one being you can authenticate based off of something that you know. Something that you know would be your password, right? And so when you type in your password, you're telling the
Hey,
system or
Dustin,
the
I'm not sure. It sounds like your audio went out briefly.
okay. Can you guys hear me now? Is this okay? Can you guys hear me? Hey, Matt, can you hear me?
Justin, I can hear you. You're good.
Okay. Okay, let me
Okay, you're good.
okay, excellent. Yeah. So I'll just roll that back a little bit. So again, talk about authentication here. And so the point that I want to make about authentication is we think about this in three ways when it comes to cybersecurity. So the first one being is that something you can authenticate based off of something that you know. This is your password, right? So when you supply your password to a system or an application, it's checking to see, yes, this is the right password. Okay, so this is the first step. The second one is something that you have. So if you have an application on your phone that's showing you maybe for multi-factor authentication codes, you have that code in your possession. The other thing that this could be is maybe there's a USB token that you plug into your computer to authenticate as well. So this is something that's physically in your possession. And then the last one is something that you are. This is biometrics. This is your iris, right? If anybody has a phone that can recognize their face, you're authenticating by something that you are. So the reason why we need to combine these concepts together is that if we just use one of them, we have what we call a single point of failure. And so if one of those items gets compromised, now somebody can authenticate as if they are you. And so what we want to do is make it a little bit harder for that to happen. So we want to combine these two concepts together, right? Let's do something that you know and something that you have, or something that you know and something that you are. So that's multi-factor authentication. And then just kind of a little bit of my experience as a forensic analyst, I hear a lot of discussions about, from some of my clients or potential clients that say to me, hey, my business email got hacked, my Outlook got hacked. And the first question that I ask them is, well, have you turned on multi-factor authentication? And it's a little bit of a loaded question because quite frankly, I already know that they haven't. And that's why this is so important, because if they had, it probably would have stopped their business email from being compromised. Now, I want to take that just a little bit further. I recently read an article that was published by Microsoft, and they were talking about multi-factor authentication for Outlook. And they gave a statistic that said only 11% of individuals and companies that have Outlook have turned on multi-factor authentication. So this is not on by default. You have to go in there and physically check a box and turn it on, right? But just to say that 11% number is really, really concerning to me, because this is such a small level of effort that can really make or break whether a hacker is going to get into your email or not. So I highly, highly, highly encourage you to go turn these things on. And so this other concept here, this logging concept, we're going to stay in these cloud-based systems that we're talking about. Now, multi-factor authentication is mostly available across the board. It's very rare that I don't see it being an option anymore, but this logging concept is a little bit less ubiquitous. So I'd probably say it's around 50-50 now. So if you go into your systems and you have some administrative settings that you can configure, I encourage you to go look and see if you can turn on user action logging. And so what this looks like is if somebody goes in and deletes a file or modifies a number in a cell or changes something, right, you're going to have a log of what that looked like. So it's really important to know when those changes occur, specifically if a hacker gets in your system. But imagine a situation maybe where you have an insider threat or an upset employee that wants to go in and delete a bunch of things in one of your cloud-based systems. At least you're going to have a log of what changed so that you can revert back if you needed to do that. So number 2 on the list, secure your company email system. So I talked about multi-factor and email. I want to make a point here, and I think this is going to be something I really encourage everybody to go do. If you want to get on top of securing your company email systems, I'm going to take a guess and say most people on the line are using Outlook. Go to the RigidBits website. We have a specific plan of action and milestones that you can go download for free and you can go follow that's going to secure your company email systems, as well as if you've been hacked or you've been compromised, we actually have a recovery section as well. And so the interesting thing about email systems for companies is that, like I said earlier, they kind of come in a certain configuration out of the box. And if you don't specifically go into them and configure them with cybersecurity best practices, they are a little bit lacking. So I'll give you a really, one of the POAM items that you'll find in that list for securing your email is going to tell you to set up alerts for any forwarding rules that are set up, because hackers love to do this. As soon as they get in your email system, they set up a forwarding rule so that all of your emails are sent to an outside entity. Maybe it's their Gmail address or whatever it may be. And so what they're doing is they're reading your emails, waiting for opportunities where they can jump in and potentially maybe, get in the middle of a financial transaction or something like that. So it's very, very, very important to go into your email systems, whoever your IT administrator is or whoever has that responsibility, go download that plan of action, follow the steps, turn on the settings, and you will be greatly, greatly protected. Yeah, I'm not sure what happened with my presentation here, but it's got a little out of order here. So the last one being, we're going to update our traditional antivirus to what we call endpoint detection and response. That's endpoint detection and response. And so I just want to talk a little bit about why this is so important. And I'm going to get a little technical here, but I'm going to do my best to explain it. So for traditional antivirus, the way that these pieces of software work is they rely on two things. One of them called heuristic detection, and the other one called signature-based detection. So heuristics is behavior. So when a file has a certain action, let's say you launch an application and it starts doing certain things in the background, malware tends to behave pretty consistently. It does some very similar actions, right? And so what your antivirus does is it checks how these files are behaving, and it says, you know what, this looks like maybe it's malware, and then it'll flag it. The other one was signature based. So this is like giving it a name. I know exactly what this file is, and I know that it's bad, so I'm going to mark it as bad. And so this was good for a while, right? This was useful for a long time, but I'm here to tell you right now that if a hacker gets into your system, I promise you they're trying to turn off your antivirus. This is definitely something that a hacker will do. If you ever have gone through a penetration test and you've had an assessment done against you, maybe the company that did this for you tried to turn off your AV. It's very, very common. So one of the things that we want to do is update to this next generation version of antivirus called endpoint detection and response. Now, endpoint detection and response is also going to use heuristics. It's also going to use signatures, but it's also going to add machine learning and artificial intelligence to basically learn how certain files are behaving. And so it's really this new advanced technology. So we really want to bring in this more advanced capability to catch bad files. And then finally, the last point that I want to make about endpoint detection and response as it compares to antivirus is that if you have traditional antivirus right now, and one of your employees gets a virus or a piece of malware on their computer, my question to you is, how do you know? And who's alerting you that this is happening? So unless that employee comes to the IT provider or the IT representative and says, hey, I got malware on my machine, you might not know. And so the interesting thing about EDR is that it has console access. So you have this centrally managed platform so that if any of your endpoints or any of your computers do get a virus or malware, you're going to be able to see it in this centralized location. So somebody with a responsibility for keeping an eye on these things, they may get an alert, an email alert, like, hey, this computer over here just reported to me that I got a piece of malware. So there's this big, big, big win here if we can go update this. Now, I will say this, EDR is a little bit more expensive than traditional antivirus, but what you're paying is worth it. So I highly encourage everybody to go find an EDR solution. If you have any questions about what this looks like, we can answer that at the end of the presentation. So we're going to take number one here, and I'm going to show you what it would look like if I was going to follow the cybersecurity process to implement multi-factor authentication. So before I do that, though, I just want to go back and I want to show you really quick what this looks like, right? So we're going to do our due diligence and our due care. We are going to come up with a plan. We're going to pick a framework that we're going to follow. We're going to find out what our risks are. We're going to list a POAM item. We're going to write a policy and a procedure, and then we're going to implement the best practice. All right, let's do that. So we're just going to assume that our plan is finished and we've kind of picked the framework that we want to do. We're going to use the CIS controls. And so what I did here was I came up with this kind of fake scenario of what a risk assessment results would look like. So in my image here, I have this system called Cloud System 1. Maybe this is your agency management system, maybe it's your payroll system, whatever it may be. And for this particular system, we came to the conclusion that this is a high-risk system. So what are the reasons why this is a high-risk system? Well, let's see, we found vulnerabilities in it, multi-factor authentication was disabled, and we didn't complete a third-party vendor assessment before making a determination if we're going to use the system or not. So we want to see these likelihood factors in a risk assessment. On the right side over here, we have impact factors. So what would the impact be to the business? Well, the system processes sensitive data. So this is something that we really need to be concerned about. There are high impacts to our confidentiality, integrity, and availability. We have a lot of secret information. We need to rely that it hasn't been changed. And somebody uses the system every day. So we need to make sure that they can get to it. And then maybe there's a breach notification requirement. Maybe you have customer data here, right? So if that system was hacked and compromised, you might have a breach notification law that you need to abide by. So these are the impact factors. So this is where we start with a risk assessment. Now I want to come over here on the left to show you guys number 2. This is the item that we're going to be addressing, multi-factor authentication. So when you do your risk assessment, you're going to see these deficiencies, right? Oh, I have a problem in the fact that I didn't turn on multi-factor authentication. That came out in my risk assessment. So my due diligence statement is, wow, I want to make sure that every single system that I have in my environment has turned on multi-factor authentication. So let's do the do care. So what does this look like? Right here, we see a screenshot of a framework. Okay, so this came out of the CIS controls. And so what I want to do is, and this can be kind of challenging, but stay with me on this. You see this word here, multi-factor authentication, right? You don't even really need to know what that means. You just need to know how to Google, or you need to know how to do a search inside of a document that you're looking for. So if I search multi-factor authentication, look, here you go. It tells me exactly what I should be doing. Use multi-factor authentication for all administrative access. Let's ignore administrative access and just say all access. This subcontrol number is 4.5. And the control description, again, just kind of says I should use multi-factor authentication and encrypted channels for account access. Okay, so my framework is telling me to do this. So now I know what I need to go do. So I'm going to create a POAM item. All right, here's a screenshot of what a plan of action and milestones might look like. So for number 2 here, I've listed multi-factor authentication. I want to address this description. I reference the cloud control that I talked about in the framework. Okay, I list that because that's the one that I'm following. And then I'm going to write a small little statement about, well, if I don't have multi-factor authentication, what can go wrong? So that's what that looks like. And then there's some other sections that you might have. Maybe you'll assign it to somebody, right? So this individual is responsible for doing this implementation. And then you're also going to maybe set a date, right? We want to do this by this time and date. And when you finish it, you can go ahead and check it off and say, I'm done with this. So we want to at least list it. All right, we're going to stay on the slide for a little bit because I think this is really important. And I think this is something that a lot of businesses struggle with. But when you decide that you're going to turn on multi-factor authentication, the first thing that you want to do is write a policy, and then you'll write a follow-up procedure. But what does a policy look like? And so what you see here, and feel free to read this, but what you see here is a screenshot from a service that we resell where we tend to write your policies and procedures for you. We pick some things and we make them very simple for you, so we write it for you. And so what does a policy answer, right? What are some of the things that I should have in my policy? Well, I want to define who it applies to. Does it apply to the entire company? Does it apply to a specific team or person? I want to call that out very specifically. And then at what frequency should this policy be considered? Well, let's use the multi-factor authentication example. So your company name, our IT representative at least yearly will review all of our cloud-based systems, right? So we want to define how often do we want to do this? And then what are the guidelines that the company is requiring the employees or itself to abide by? This company will require all cloud-based systems to have multi-factor authentication turned on. Okay, that's your policy statement. And then finally, it may be worth listing when the policy was created and when it was last updated, because if you go several years without updating your policy, it may be worth knowing when the last time was so you can go look at the ones that haven't been updated and then go eventually update them. All right, and then over here on the right side are your procedures, right? So your procedures are, these are the things that I'm going to do to make sure that I turn on multi-factor authentication. So what are the steps that this company needs to abide by? What are the actionable items that need to take place for me to abide by my policy? At what frequency should I do this? Is this a task that I do quarterly, biannually, annually? So you want to define that. Who's going to do this? Is your IT representative, your managed service provider, maybe an internal employee? So you want to call them out specifically. And then these last two bullet points kind of go together, but is there any further documentation that I need to reference, or are there any tracking sheets and spreadsheets that I need to update? And what I mean by that is, if you've listed all of your cloud systems, it may be worth going in one by one and saying, okay, I checked this one and it has multi-factor on. I checked the next one and this one is off, right? So you might need to do some updating of documentation as you follow these policies and procedures. All right, we're almost done. We're getting there. And then finally, the last thing is implementation, right? So I'm actually showing you a screenshot here of me checking that a Google account has two-step verification turned on. Two-step verification or multi-factor authentication, kind of the same thing. And so if this was off, my big win for little effort would be just clicking this thing and turning it on, okay? So we actually have to go and turn these things on. And so you'll repeat this process for all of your cloud-based systems. So I just showed you how to do cybersecurity. So for those 4 items that I've listed for the big wins for little effort, you can follow this exact same process. And what you're doing as you do this is you are building your cybersecurity program, and you're addressing the compliance requirements that you may have and the laws that you might need to abide by, because this is what they're asking you to do. So these are the easy things. The last point I think I want to make about this presentation is that there may be a situation where, as you start looking at some of the deficiencies that get identified in your risk assessment, you might go, wow, I don't know how to do this. I don't have the technical knowledge to get this done. So I showed you some easy things, but there are going to be some hard things that are going to come out of this too. So what I would encourage you to do is go look for some help, go read some documentation, try to get some assistance on some of those more difficult topics so that you can really get your cybersecurity program under control. And then I just want to finish the presentation with a closing thought here from one of my favorite movies. This is from The Matrix. This is Morpheus talking to Neo. He says, "I'm trying to free your mind, but I can only show you the door. You're the one that must walk through it." And so what I mean by that is, you can take this information and you can run with it. You can implement these cybersecurity best practices. You now understand risk. You now understand the use of a POAM and what a framework looks like, right? So you have this knowledge now. So what I would encourage you to do is follow this process, grab the rest of those items in the list, and start checking them off one by one. And with that, I'm going to just open this up to any questions. And let me just take a look here. Tyler, did you notice any questions or anything like that? I don't think I see any.
I do not see any questions either. Matt, any questions come in on your end?
No, I do not see any. Just people asking if the recording will be available, and yes, it will on Monday on iit.org.
Okay. And then just to repeat, maybe right before I go, feel free to go to the RigidBits website, download that plan of action and milestones for your business email protection. That's a big win for little effort as well.
Well, Justin, thank you so much. And again, thanks to IIT's lead underwriters. Just a quick reminder before we end, virtual InsureCon will continue next Thursday starting at 10 a.m. with a keynote from insurance industry tech expert and author Steve Anderson titled "What Every Agency Can Learn from Amazon." There's still time to register for next Thursday's sessions. Go to iit.org/InsureCon and click on the registration buttons located next to the session titles you want to attend. I hope you'll join us again next week. Thank you and have a great day.